You described the God of the Old Testament, you said, is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Quite a mouthful. Do you still stand by that description of the God of the Old Testament?
Yes, I think the Bible is authored by God. And God, in those terror passages, which are not negligible in the Old Testament, they're actually quite prominent, is a horrifically unpleasant character. There's no getting away from that.
Coming back to you then, Richard, how do you take the Old Testament? Do you believe that it is essentially mainly fictional sort of literature?
I'd be surprised if very much of it was factual. The early parts of it, the Pentateuch is clearly the Jewish foundational myth. It includes the creation myths and the sort of myths of the origin of the Jewish people. I understand from archaeological friends there's almost no factual content in it. There certainly isn't any factual content in the scientific parts, in the bits about creation of the world and the universe and so on. And I suspect there's rather little factual content in the stories of Abraham, of the exile in Egypt, of the escape from Egypt, the Egyptian plagues, and so on. So it is a collection of myths. They happen to be Jewish myths. Some of them are inherited from earlier peoples like the Sumerians. As myths, they are fascinating. I mean, myths all around the world are fascinating. All three of us happen to have been born into cultures which were immersed in this particular Jewish myth, as opposed to the myths of the North American Indians, or of the Chinese, or of the Indians, or South Sea Islanders, or any of the other myths, or Africans, any of the other myths that we could have been brought up in. So there is really no reason at all to be talking about the Jewish myths any more than any of the other myths around the world. All of them are anthropologically interesting, but that's it.
You're looking a bit pensive there, Josh, in response.
Well, I mean, I can understand why Richard would say that. As a Jew, obviously, I come to those texts in a very particularistic way, which is they're my foundational myths. That is, I am necessarily in relationship with them if I am going to live as part of a Jewish religious and cultural life. So they are the foundational texts of my people. They're the formative stuff of the religious and cultural life that I lead. I mean, as it turns out, I doubt that Rich and I will disagree very much on issues of historicity. What we're going to differ on, I think, is probably whether or not that text continues to enrich people's lives. And as a Jew, it clearly continues to enrich my life. It is the foundational myth of the people of which I'm part.
Would it be fair?
The formative stuff that I do. It's my poetry, my story, the source of the legal code which then came to shape my religious and cultural practice. So as a Jew, I have a very particularistic relationship with it.
Go ahead, Richard.
Well, presumably you would agree that if you happen to have been born in China or India or Fiji or somewhere, you would say, well, the Fijian myths are the myths of my people, the Indian myths are the Hindu myths are the myths of my people. I mean, you recognize the arbitrary accident of the fact that you happen to have been born into a Jewish household, and that's why these are the myths of your people.
Right. I mean, I think our own personal religious and cultural identities are, inevitably arbitrary to some extent, but it is mine, and that's for me to live as a Jewish life engaged with my cultural traditions involves being in relationship with that text.
I'd be interested, Chris, but a couple of things that Richard pointed out as he started there. He doesn't believe there's any historical basis really to most of the Old Testament. Is that something you disagree with yourself?
I would disagree with that. I think, though, just to clarify, there's a couple of words that we've been using so far that I do think need some unpacking. One is the word literal, and what do we mean by literal interpretation? And the other is the word myth, which is very easy to use, but I think there's a much more complicated debate around what we mean by myth. And in fact, to be honest with you, in terms of popular debate, I think the word myth has been so stripped of any clear meaning that it's almost a useless word, which would have been much to the annoyance of someone like Tolkien, who spends so much time discussing mythology and the meaning of myth. So just to take these two words very, very quickly. First of all, if I could go with the word literal first, then what do we mean by interpreting the book literally? literal does not mean simply interpreting something for its face value meaning. That the sun rises and the sun sets. This is language we clearly know it's a conventional way of speaking about the relationship of the sun to the earth as we view it from our viewing platform. Likewise, with the Old Testament, we could talk about how there is a perspective on history and the world, and that's reflected in the way the stories are told. So to interpret the Old Testament literally doesn't mean always taking it at its face value. It means taking it seriously for the kind of literature it is. And myth, I don't think, is a particularly helpful word here. I mean, theologians use the word saga sometimes to describe the Old Testament. And I think that might be more helpful, because when we think about the history of the Old Testament, I'm sure Richard would agree that there's a historical kernel to the Old Testament story. I'm sure he wouldn't doubt that there's a historical story unfolding, but it's to what extent is that wrapped up in figures of speech and forms of writing and perhaps later traditions that have been incorporated into the story. That's what we need to disentangle. But that there's a core of history, I'm absolutely...
And do you feel that is confirmed by archaeology and so on when you look into some of these core aspects of the Old Testament's history?
I do. I've been involved in an archaeological dig in Israel and for a couple of seasons, and what I'm aware of, I don't know which friends Richard was talking to at Oxford, but there really is a wide open debate here. I mean, you'll have archaeology doesn't provide a discipline where things are coming up from the ground date stamped. I mean, until you get to coins anyway. They're not date stamped with a record of who said what to who. Archaeology provides evidence which can be ambiguous, it needs explaining, and so there's a very vigorous debate going on in archaeology right now, and there are those who hold to a minimalist position and would suggest that there's very little evidence at all for the events of the Old Testament, but there's a very significant number of archaeologists, a very significant number, who would argue for what's sometimes called a more maximalist approach to reading the evidence, people like William Dever or Kenneth Kitchen.
Sorry, I mean,
do you disagree with that?
Well, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I do think we need to be very careful about two things. One is, perhaps the really fundamental question is whether historicity matters. Whether actually, this is not a history book. That's not its function. It's not a science book. It is a people's grappling with their identity, their story, their experience of the world around them, that then came to inform other people's doing of that same thing. So for me, I'm, as it happens, deeply unconcerned with historicity. That doesn't bother me at all. I do think we need to recognise also that the Old Testament is not a unity, that there are different books within it doing different things. Clearly, there are points in the sort of pseudo-historical books at which the Old Testament is describing events that we know took place, because we have evidence, we have quite a lot of it in the British Museum, which describes the event taking place. But the Bible isn't doing history, it's doing theology. So when the Babylonians rampage and destroy Jerusalem, we know that happened. We know that the Bible is describing it. But the Bible is doing theology. It's seeing that in terms of reward and punishment and behaviour. It's doing a different thing.
The Old Testament doesn't match reality. Genesis says the earth was created in 6 days. Physics and cosmology show a universe that's about 13.8 billion years old, with Earth forming around 4.5 billion years ago. The flood story claims the entire planet was covered in water. Geology shows no global flood layer. Civilizations like Egypt and Mesopotamia continued without interruption during the time that flood was supposed to happen. The Exodus describes hundreds of thousands of people leaving Egypt. Archaeology finds no evidence. No campsites, no remains, no records from Egypt, which documented everything. And many of these stories closely match older myths. The flood story mirrors the Epic of Gilgamesh. Creation themes appear in earlier Mesopotamian texts.
Do you, Richard, coming back to you, do you think that the Bible has, the Old Testament especially, any value in terms of a moral dimension that it may cast?
Oh, now you're changing the subject, and that's an interesting change.
Well, I just wanted to, we'll cover a variety of subjects, hopefully.
Yeah, I agree with Josh that historicity doesn't really matter, but I think I put it in a slightly different way. It doesn't matter because you wouldn't be bothering to ask the question about the, say, creation myths or the tribal myths of the Incas or the Aztecs. They are interesting, they're fascinating myths. But you wouldn't be having a debate to say, is there any historicity in the stories of sun gods and things? The only reason we're bothering to ask the question about the historicity of the Jewish myths is that we happen to be brought up in them. But they are not special. They are just tribal myths like any other.
I mean, well, Chris,
could I make a distinction there? Because, you gave a very helpful description right at the beginning of the power and influence of the Old Testament narratives on Western culture. And I'd go even further than that and say that even history writing itself can find its roots in the Old Testament, in the way the Old Testament was written. Not that it's history, accept Josh's point that it's not history as in a modern history textbook, it's not science as a modern science textbook. But in terms of a history, it formulates a way of describing events which have a certain linearity and a certain meaning, which is reflected in the historical traditions, which will, we also look to the Greeks and Herodotus, but in terms of the modern world, our development of history and our understanding of history reflects a view which we find in the Old Testament, which I don't think we find in the Chronicles of Babylon. I don't think we find them in the Inca myths. I mean, that's for sure.
So you would, in a sense, then say it's not just sort of equal weighting between different myths around the world. There's something quite unique about the Old Testament. Okay, Richard?
I just don't see that. I mean, I notice you're quite happy about using the word myth for the Inca myths and the Aztec myths.
Yes, I'm not saying that the word myth. I'm using it because you used it to describe their stories and legends, and I do accept there is a category called myth. I just want to define it very carefully.
Yes,
I think myth does not have that rooting in linear historical progression,
no.
And that's where I think our modern understanding of history has a much more of a reliance on the Jewish tradition than would have come out of the Inca mythological cycles. Stories which aren't rooted in time and place. I mean, we find that in the great Hindu epics as well, which, again, are not rooted in time and place, not concerned with the genealogies and the locations and who was king when, in the way that the Old Testament narrators were.
Yes, Richard, and then we'll bring in George.
Well, that may be so. I mean, I don't think it's a very, I don't think it's a very deeply important point. If it's so, I suspect the same is probably true of some other mythologies. I don't want to make a big thing of it.
But it's deeply important in terms of our respect for the historical processes and the development of history as a Western discipline. And that's why this is important. I mean, it's foundational for more than just the Jewish people. It's foundational in other respects.
There's so much of the Old Testament which is taken to be historical. I mean, both of you gentlemen are sophisticated who don't do this, but the fact is that more than 40% of the American population think that the book of Genesis, including the six-day story of creation, is literally true. And this is a problem which I have as a scientist, and I hope and believe that both of you stand up and vigorously oppose such literalistic fundamentalism.
Right, but I think that is because we recognise, certainly I recognise, that that's not the function of this text. I want to step back a little bit, because I think Richard is actually asking probably one of the fundamental questions about religion, which is, why should we privilege this particular text over any other text?
Exactly.
What is it that gives it its enduring power, if it has any, and how do we then engage with it? And, classically, the answer would be something around authorship. That is, that there is a divine authorship that gives this text its weight, gives this text its authority. Mm-hmm. We may also say there's something in the values of that text, which something it expresses, or it may be that very personal relationship that lots of people have ended up with that text. And then, my job as someone working in religion is to help that journey to be one which is done with integrity.
Well, if I may, I will move the subject along a little bit. And there was a very famous, long sort of description of God, the Old Testament God, in the God Delusion. Richard, and I'm sure you know what I'm about to mention. You described the God of the Old Testament, you said, is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Quite a mouthful. Do you still stand by that description of the God of the Old Testament that
Yes,
you
I do.
gave?
I was accused of anti-Semitism by the recent chief rabbi, Jonathan Sachs. I don't know why he thought it was anti-Semitic. It's anti-God. But I mean, that of course refers to what's been called here the terror passages, and the terror passages are taken literally by some, particularly American theologians, and many people do actually believe, as I think it was Josh was recently saying, that the Bible is authored by God, and God, in those terror passages, which are not negligible in the Old Testament, they're actually quite prominent, is a horrifically unpleasant character. There's no getting away from that.
Okay. As you mentioned, the former Chief Rabbi, Lord Sachs, said that he thought it was a profoundly anti-Semitic passage in the God Delusion. Why do you differ from him on that? He suggested that you were continuing a strain in certain anti-Semitic thinking that was essentially about saying, well, we've got a better God in the New Testament than in the Old Testament, and so on.
I don't think we've got a better God in the New Testament. I think there's something exceedingly unpleasant in the fundamental Christian doctrine of atonement, of the idea of God being unable to forgive our sins unless he tortured his son, alias himself, in the first place. And that's a revolting doctrine, actually. In some ways, it's worse than anything in the Old Testament. But that wasn't the point. When I said the God of the Old Testament, I simply meant the God of the Old Testament. What Rabbi Sachs heard was the God of the Jews, which of course is true. But that wasn't why I was singling it out. I was singling it out because the terror passages are literally horrible.
In Deuteronomy 20, entire cities are ordered to be wiped out. Men, women, children. In 1 Samuel 15, God commands killing infants. Exodus 21 gives rules for owning slaves, including how hard you can beat them. That's not misunderstood. That's written clearly. So when Justin tries to elevate this text as something unique or foundational for morality, the question is simple. Why? These same kinds of stories exist in other ancient cultures. Violence, tribal loyalty, divine commands. Nothing special. And here's the bigger issue. If morality comes from this book, then morality includes genocide, slavery, and punishment based on belief. That's not moral progress. That's ancient human thinking written down.
What I was concerned about was how simplistic that line is, because what it fails to recognise is that the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, is not univocal. It has a number of different texts within it, and it has a number of different versions of how we can understand God within it. Inevitably, because it's a product of different people and different times grappling with those very issues. So the vindictive God whom Richard describes is one version. I think we maybe want to argue about the use of the word vindictive. But, there is also a deeply, deeply ethical God who 3,000 years ago is saying to the Israelites, you have to care about the vulnerable in your society, you have to do your business honestly, you have to look after your workers, you have to care about the immigrant who comes into your society. So to only describe the God of the Old Testament in that way, I think is actually just simplistic and doesn't help us to really engage with the Old Testament as a whole.
Richard, any response?
Yeah, I accept that, of course. It was a passage that it was semi-tongue-in-cheek, actually, because, when I do public readings of my books, I do it with my wife, and we usually try to get a laugh from the audience early on in our performance, because it sort of lightens up the atmosphere. And that passage we always used when doing the God Delusion readings, right at the beginning, because it does get the audience roaring with laughter, and it sort of puts the audience in a friendly mood simply because they laugh. So there was a sort of, I think I went on to describe a story of Randolph Churchill, who had a similar reaction. He'd never actually read the Bible before, and he was challenged by Evelyn Waugh and a brother officer during the war to read the Bible. And he kept on exclaiming how horrified he was by God. And so it was a sort of humorous passage. And I do accept that if you look through either the Old Testament or the New Testament, you can certainly find passages of wisdom, passages that one would ethically approve of, tucked in amongst the others that one wouldn't ethically approve of. I suppose I spend a lot of time in America, and I'm very conscious that the bulk of my audience, the audience, not the bulk of them, but the audience that I'm really trying to reach, is largely an American audience. And I presume that both Chris and Josh know how many people in America actually do take the Bible literally. And you have to read the God delusion through that filter, that I'm actually aiming it, at least partly, at those people in America who are my enemies as a scientist, who are actually subverting scientific education in a very serious way. So in a sense, I wasn't trying to irritate nice, decent liberal theologians like Chris and John.
Well, I mean, can I come in on this one, Richard? I would say straight away that I'm not offended at all. And it's certainly with my friends, with other Christians, I would want to defend to the hill your right to crack jokes. And, I'm not one for blasphemy myself, but I certainly think that we need to have the tolerance and freedom in society to allow this kind of sometimes knockabout stuff. I think that is perfectly legitimate. And so I think to start being offended by it, I think there's a kind of political correctness in our society that's very dangerous, actually, because it can prevent us from having frank and open discussion. The problem, though, I think, and Josh touched on it by talking about the simplification that's going on here, is that, Richard, you are very good with rhetoric. You have a very powerful mastery of the English language. And that rhetoric can be very bullying sometimes. And I think the way in which that passage is put, again, I'm not, don't worry, I'm not saying that I'm offended or you should take the passage out. I'm not suggesting that. But in terms of the passage, it's clearly a very slanted view of how to read the text of the Old Testament. I mean, most of us would take the clearer passages to interpret the harder passages. We would be talking about Leviticus 19, love your neighbour as yourself, before we're looking at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So, we would have an approach to Scripture that would weight things in such a way that description of God just does not sound like the God who I believe in or the God who I worship. So the rhetoric, I think, can generate a lot more heat than it does light.
That's probably fair, yes.
Okay.
It's being terribly reasonable.
We are.
It's a very reasonable,
Sorry,
very
ruining
reasonable
this discussion. Yes, I need more fireworks, everyone, if you don't mind. Let's talk about some of these so-called terror passages, though. And they were right there on our screens on Saturday night on the first episode of the Bible. And I think we often forget the fact that there are some pretty interesting episodes. Now, you certainly bring up a couple of these in The God Delusion, Richard. Let's talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, for instance. Now, that is the story in Genesis, I think it's chapter 19, in which Lot has angelic visitors and the townspeople come and they demand that they essentially rape these visitors that he has with them. And he tells them not to do that. He essentially offers his daughters instead. But then there is sort of an intervention by God, and Lot and so on escape. Fire and brimstone rain down on Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, Richard, for you, is this an example of a sort of morally repugnant story in the Old Testament?
I would only want to say something like that if there were anybody who took their morals from the Old Testament. And if you take your morals from the Old Testament, then that is a repugnant story, as are some of the other ones. But I hope you don't take your morals from the Old Testament. There are people in America who do. And those are the people that I need to call their attention to stories like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and of Lot offering.
Well, now, you say they take... I mean, I don't personally... I know quite a few evangelical Christians in America, but I don't know any that base their morality on this story, for instance.
No, but how do they decide which stories to base their morality on? Mm-hmm. It's all very well saying love your neighbour as yourself is good, or the Sermon on the Mount is good, Sodom and Gomorrah is horrid. But when you decide which of those stories to base your morals on, you're not using biblical methods in order to do your deciding. You're using the methods of a modern moralist, which all four of us are,
not at
in
all,
order
Richard.
to pick out the good verses from the bad.
I think Chris Sinkinson wants to come in here.
Sorry, Richard, I would be using normal methods of interpretation where we look at the genre and we ask, What is the passage doing? What is a book doing? What is the context doing? And in particular, is it prescriptive or is it descriptive? Now, Leviticus 19, I think, is giving prescriptions. We still need to interpret them in terms of their time and place in the ancient Near Eastern worldview. But there are prescriptions there I need to deal with and find the principles from which I can learn. With the Sodom and Gomorrah story, it is a descriptive passage that is appalling. And to try and base any morals on the Sodom and Gomorrah story, I wouldn't even know where to begin, because I don't think it's that kind of literature. I don't think it's giving us a prescription for life. In fact, actually, Richard, if I may, I think you make a great comment on the Sodom and Gomorrah story and the behaviour of Lot, because you reflect on Lot in the God delusion. And then your summary sentence, I think, is very perceptive. You say, if this dysfunctional family was the best that Sodom had to offer by way of morals, some might begin to feel a certain sympathy with God and his judicial brimstone. Well, Rabbi Dawkins, I mean, I think I'm very happy with that gloss.
He now admits the Bible has multiple versions of God, different voices, different ideas. That's not divine clarity. That's human authors writing over time. Then he tries to rescue it, focus on the good parts. Love your neighbor, care for the poor. But here's the problem. Those ideas didn't start with the Bible. Versions of them existed in earlier cultures like Egypt and Mesopotamia. They're human values, not proof of a divine source. And when it comes to the bad parts, suddenly it's context, genre. Don't take it that way. That's selective reading. You don't need a holy book to tell you slavery is wrong, or that offering your daughters to a mob, like in Genesis 19, is disturbing. People already know that. So be honest. Are these morals coming from the Bible? Or are people bringing their own modern values and filtering the Bible through them? So after everything we've looked at, contradictions, missing evidence, and shifting interpretations, where do you stand? Do you think the Bible is a reliable source of truth, or just a collection of human stories shaped over time? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your take. And if you want more breakdowns like this, don't forget to like and subscribe.